The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel Phillips Huntington. Chapter 5: Economics, Demography, and the Challenger Civilizations. Meanwhile, in Japan, in the 1980s, successful economic development contrasted with the perceived failures and decline of the American economy and social system led Japanese to become increasingly disenchanted with Western models and increasingly convinced that the sources of their success must lie within their own culture. The Japanese culture, which produced military disaster in 1945 and hence had to be rejected, had produced economic triumph by 1985 and hence could be embraced. The increased familiarity of Japanese with Western society led them to realize that being Western is not magically wonderful in or and of itself. They get that out of their system. While the Japanese of the Meiji Restoration adopted a policy of disengaging from Asia and joining Europe, the Japanese of the late 20th century cultural revival endorsed a policy of distancing from America and engaging Asia. This trend involved first a re identification with Japanese culture and traditions and renewed assertion of the values of those traditions, and second, and more problematical, an effort to Asianize Japan and identify Japan despite its distinctive civilization with a general Asian culture. Given the extent to which, after World War II, Japan, in contrast to China, identified itself with the West, and given the extent to which the West, whatever its failings, did not collapse totally as the Soviet Union did, the incentives for Japan to reject the West totally have been nowhere near as great as those for China to distance itself from both the Soviet and Western models. On the other hand, the uniqueness of Japanese civilization, the memories in the other countries of Japanese imperialism, and economic centrality of Chinese in most other Asian countries also mean that it will be easier for Japan to distance itself from the West than it will be for it to be blend itself with Asia. By reasserting its own cultural identity, Japan emphasizes its uniqueness and its differences from both Western and other Asian cultures. While Chinese and Japanese found new value in their own cultures, they also shared in a broader reassertion of the value of Asian culture generally compared to that of the West. Industrialization and the growth that accompanied it produced in the 1980s and 1990s articulations by East Asians of what may be appropriately termed the Asian affirmation. This complex of attitudes has four major components. First, Asians believe that East Asia will sustain its rapid economic development, will soon surpass the West in economic product, and hence will be increasingly powerful in world affairs compared to the West. Economic growth stimulates among Asian societies a sense of power and an affirmation of their ability to stand up to the West. The days when the United States sneezed and Asia caught cold are over, declared a leading Japanese journalist in 1993. And a Malaysian official added to the medical metaphor that even a high fever in America will not make Asia cough. Asians, another Asian leader said, are at the end of the era of awe and the beginning of the era of talking back in their relations with the United States. Asia's increasing prosperity, Malaysia's deputy prime minister asserted, means that it is now in a position to offer serious alternatives to the dominant global political, social, and economic arrangements. It also means East Asians argue that the West is rapidly losing its ability to make Asian societies conform to Western standards concerning human rights and other values. Second, Asians believe this economic success is largely a product of Asian culture, which is superior to that of the West, which is culturally and socially decadent. During the heady days of the 1980s, when the Japanese economy exports, trade balance, and foreign exchange reserves were booming, the Japanese, like the Saudis before them, boasted of their new economic power, spoke contemptuously of the decline of the West, and attributed their success and Western failings to the superiority of their culture and the decadence of the Western culture. In the early 1990s, Asian triumphalism was articulated anew in what can only be described as the Singaporean cultural offensive. From Lee Kuan Yew on down, Singaporean leaders trumpeted the rise of Asian in relation to the West and contrasted the virtues of Asian, basically Confucianism, culture responsible for this success, order, discipline, family responsibility, hard work, collectivism, abstemiousness, to the self-indulgence, sloth, individualism, crime, inferior education, disrespect for authority, and mental ossification responsible for the decline of the West. To compete with the East, it was argued, the United States needs to question its fundamental assumptions about its social and political arrangements, and in the process, learn a thing or two from East Asian societies. For East Asians, East Asian success is particularly the result of the East Asian cultural stress on the collectivity rather than the individual. The more communitarian values and practices of the East Asians, the Japanese, Koreans, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, and the Singaporeans, have proved to be clear assets in the catching up process, argued Lee Kuan Yew. The values that East Asian culture holds up, such as the primacy of group interests over individual interests, support the total group effort necessary to develop rapidly. The work ethic of the Japanese and Koreans, consisting of discipline, loyalty, and diligence, Malaysia's Prime Minister agreed, has served as the motive force for their respective countries' economic and social development. This work ethic is born out of the philosophy that the group and the country are more important than the individual. Third, while recognizing the differences among Asian societies, the civilizations, East Asians argue that there are also significant commonalities. Central among these, one Chinese dissident observed, is the value system of Confucianism, honored by history and shared by most of the countries in the region, particularly its emphasis on thrift, family, work, and discipline. Equally important is the shared rejection of individualism and the prevalence of soft authoritarianism or very limited forms of democracy. Asian societies have common interests vis-a-vis the West in defending these distinctive values and promoting their own economic interests. Asians argue that this requires the development of new forms of intra-Asian cooperation, such as the expansion of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the creation of East Asian Economic Caucus. While the immediate economic interest of East Asian societies is to maintain access to Western markets, in the longer term, economic regionalism is likely to prevail, and hence East Asia must increasingly promote intra-Asian trade and investment. In particular, it is necessary for Japan, as a leader in Asian development, to move away from its historic policy of de-Asianization and pro-Westernization and to pursue a path of re-Asianization, or more broadly to promote the Asianization of Asia, a path endorsed by Singaporean officials. Fourth, East Asians argue that Asian development and Asian values are models which other non Western societies should emulate in their efforts to catch up with the West, and which the West should adopt in order to renew itself. The Anglo Saxon developmental model, or so revered over the past 4 decades, as the best means of modernizing the economies of developing nations and of building a viable political system isn't working. East Asians allege the East Asian model is taking its place as countries from Mexico and Chile to Iran and Turkey and the former Soviet republics now attempt to learn from its success, even as previous generations attempted to learn from Western success. Asia must transmit to the rest of the world those Asian values that are of universal worth. The transmission of this ideal means the expert of the social system of Asia. East Asia in particular, it is necessary for Japan and other Asian countries to promote Pacific globalism, to globalize Asia, and hence to decisively shape the character of the new world order. Powerful societies are universalistic. Weak societies are particularistic. The mounting of self-confidence of East Asia has given rise to an emerging Asian universalism, comparable to that which has been characteristic of the West. Asian values are universal values. European values are European values, declaimed the Prime Minister Mahathir to the heads of European governments in 1996. Along with this also comes an Asian Occidentalism, portraying the West in much the same uniform and negative way which Western Orientalism allegedly once portrayed the East. To the East Asians, economic prosperity is proof of moral superiority. If at some point India supplants East Asia as the world's economically most rapidly developing area, the world should be prepared for extended disquisitions on the superiority of Hindu culture, the contributions of the caste system to economic development, and how, by returning to its roots and overcoming the deadening Western legacy left by British imperialism, India finally achieved its proper place in the top rank of civilizations. Cultural assertion follows material success. Hard power generates soft power. The Islamic resurgence. While Asians became increasingly assertive as a result of economic development, Muslims in massive numbers were simultaneously turning towards Islam as a source of identity, meaning, stability, legitimacy, development, power, and hope. Hope epitomized in the slogan, Islam is the solution. This Islamic resurgence is, in its extent and profundity, the latest phase in the adjustment of Islamic civilization to the West, an effort to find the solution not in the Western ideologies but in Islam. It embodies acceptance of modernity, rejection of Western culture, and recommitment to Islam as the guide to life in the modern world. As a top Saudi official explained in 1994, foreign imports are nice as shiny or high-tech things, but intangible social and political institutions imported from elsewhere can be deadly. Ask the Shah of Iran. Islam for us is not just a religion but a way of life. We Saudis want to modernize but not necessarily westernize. The Islamic resurgence is the effort by Muslims to achieve this goal. It is a broad intellectual, cultural, social, and political movement prevalent throughout the Islamic world. Islamic fundamentalism, commonly conceived as political Islam, is only one component in the much more extensive revival of Islamic ideas, practices, and rhetoric, and the rededication to Islam by Muslim populations. The resurgence is mainstream, not extremist, pervasive, not isolated. The resurgence has affected Muslims in every country and most aspects of society and politics in most Muslim countries. The indices of an Islamic awakening in personal life, John L. Esposito has written, are many. Increased attention to religious observances, mosque attendance, prayer, fasting, proliferation of religious programming and publications, more emphasis on Islamic dress and values, the revitalization of Sufism, mysticism. This broader based renewal has also been accompanied by Islam's reassertion in public life, an increase in Islamically oriented governments, organizations, laws, banks, social welfare services, and educational institutions. Both governments and opposition movements have turned to Islam to enhance their authority and muster popular support. Most rulers and governments, including more secular states such as Turkey and Tunisia, becoming aware of the potential strength of Islam, have shown increased sensitivity to and anxiety about Islamic issues. In similar terms, another distinguished scholar of Islam, Ali E. Halal Disauki, sees the resurgence as involving efforts to reinstitute Islamic law in place of Western law, the increased use of religious language and symbolism, expansion of Islamic education manifested in the multiplication of Islamic schools and Islamization of the curricula in regular state schools, increased adherence to Islamic codes of social behavior, for example, female covering, abstinence from alcohol, and increased participation in religious observances, domination of the opposition to secular governments in Muslim societies by Islamic groups, and expanding efforts to develop international solidarity among Islamic states and societies. La revanche de Dieu is a global phenomenon, but God, or rather Allah, has made his revenge most pervasive and fulfilling in the Ummah, the community of Islam. In its political manifestations, the Islamic resurgence bears some resemblance to Marxism, with scriptural text, a vision of the perfect society, commitment to fundamental change, rejection of the powers that be and the nation state, and doctrinal diversity ranging from moderate reformist to violent revolutionary. A more useful analogy, however, is the Protestant Reformation. Both are reactions to the stagnation and corruption of existing institutions, advocate a return to a purer and more demanding form of their religion, preach work, order, and discipline, and appeal to emerging dynamic middle class people. Both are also complex movements with diverse strands, but two major ones: Lutheranism and Calvinism, Shiite and Sunni fundamentalism, and even parallels between John Calvin and the Ayatollah Khomeini and the monastic discipline they tried to impose on their societies. The central spirit of both the Reformation and the Resurgence is fundamental reform. Reformation must be universal, one Puritan minister declared. Reform all places, all persons and callings. Reform the benches of judgment, the inferior magistrates. Reform the universities. Reform the cities. Reform the countries. Reform inferior schools of learning. Reform the Sabbath. Reform the ordinances, the worship of God. In similar terms, At-Turabi asserts this awakening is comprehensive. It is not just about individual piety, it is not just intellectual and cultural, nor is it just political. It is all of these, a comprehensive reconstruction of society from top to bottom. To ignore the impact of the Islamic resurgence on Eastern Hemisphere politics in the late 20th century is equivalent to ignoring the impact of the Protestant Reformation on European politics in the late 16th century. This resurgence differs from Reformation in one key aspect. The latter's impact was largely limited to Northern Europe. It made little progress in Spain, Italy, Eastern Europe, and the Habsburg lands generally. The resurgence, in contrast, has touched almost every Muslim society. Beginning in the 1970s, Islamic symbols, beliefs, practices, institutions, policies, and organizations won increasing commitment and support throughout the world of 1 billion Muslims, stretching from Morocco to Indonesia and from Nigeria to Kazakhstan. Islamization tended to occur first in the cultural realm and then to move on to the social and political spheres. Intellectual and political leaders, whether they favored it or not, could neither ignore it nor avoid adapting to it in one way or another. Sweeping generalizations are always dangerous and often wrong. One, however, does seem justified. In 1995, every country with a predominantly Muslim population, except Iran, were more Islamic and Islamist culturally, socially, and politically than it was 15 years earlier. In most countries, a central element of Islamization was the development of Islamic social organizations and the capture of previously existing organizations by Islamic groups. Islamists paid particular attention both to establishing Islamic schools and to expanding Islamic influence in state schools. In effect, Islamic groups brought into existence in Islamic civil society, which paralleled, surpassed, and often supplanted in scope and activity the frequently frail institutions of secular civil society. In Egypt, by the early 1990s, Islamic organizations had developed an extensive network of organizations which, filling a vacuum left by the government, provided health, welfare, educational, and other services to a large number of Egypt's poor. After 1992 earthquake in Cairo, these organizations were on the streets within hours, handing out food and blankets while the government's relief efforts lagged. In Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood consciously pursued a policy of developing the social and cultural infrastructure of an Islamic republic. And by the early 1990s, in this small country of 4 million people, was operating a large hospital, 20 clinics, 40 Islamic schools, and 120 Quranic study centers. Next door in the West Bank and Gaza, Islamic organizations established and operated student unions, youth organizations, and religious, social, and educational associations, including schools ranging from kindergartens to an Islamic university, clinics, orphanages, a retirement home, and a system of Islamic judges and arbitrators. Islamic organizations spread throughout Indonesia in the 1970s and 1980s. By the early 1980s, the largest, the Muhammadiyah, had 6 million members, constituted a religious welfare state within the secular state, and provided cradle-to-grave services for the entire country through an elaborate network of schools, clinics, hospitals, and university-level institutions. In these and other Muslim societies, Islamist organizations banned from political activity were providing social services comparable to those of the political machines in the United States in the early 20th century. The political manifestations of the resurgence have been less pervasive than its social and cultural manifestations. but they still are the single most important political development in Muslim societies in the last quarter of the 20th century. The extent and makeup of the political support for Islamist movements has varied from country to country. Yet, certain broad tendencies exist. By and large, those movements do not get much support from rural elites, peasants, and the elderly. Like fundamentalists in other religions, Islamists are overwhelmingly participants in and products of the process of modernization. They are mobile and modern oriented younger people drawn in large part from three groups. As with most revolutionary movements, the core element has consisted of students and intellectuals. In most countries, fundamentalists winning control of student unions and similar organizations was the first phase in the process of political Islamization, with the Islamist breakthrough in universities occurring in the 1970s in Egypt, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and then moving on to other Muslim countries. The Islamist appeal was particularly strong among students in technical institutions, engineering faculties, and scientific departments. In the 1990s, in Saudi Arabia, Algeria, and elsewhere, second generation indigenization was manifesting itself with increasing proportions of university students being educated in their home language and hence increasingly exposed to Islamic influences. Islamists also often developed a substantial appeal to women, and Turkey witnessed a clear demarcation between the older generation of secularist women and their Islamist oriented daughters and granddaughters. One study of the militant leaders of Egyptian Islamist groups found they had five major characteristics which appear to be typical of Islamists in other countries. Were young, overwhelmingly in their 20s and 30s. 80% were university students or university graduates. Over half came from elite colleges or from the intellectually most demanding fields of technical specialization such as medicine and engineering. Over 70% were from lower middle class, modest but not poor background, and were the first generation in their family to get higher education. They spent their childhoods in small towns or rural areas but had become residents of large cities. While students and intellectuals formed the militant cadres and shock troops of the Islamic movements, urban middle class people made up the bulk of the active membership. In some degree, these came from what are often termed traditional middle class groups: merchants, traders, small business proprietors, bazaris. These played a crucial role in the Iranian Revolution and provided significant support to the fundamentalist movements in Algeria, Turkey, and Indonesia. To an even greater extent, however, fundamentalists belong to the more modern sectors of the middle class. Islamic activists probably include a disproportionately large number of the best educated and most intelligent young people in their respective populations, including doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists, teachers, and civil servants. The third key element in the Islamist constituency was recent migrants to the cities. Throughout the Islamic world in the 1970s and the 1980s, urban populations grew at a dramatic rate. Crowded into decaying and often primitive slum areas, the urban migrants needed and were the beneficiaries of the social services provided by Islamist organizations. In addition, Ernest Gellner points out Islam offered a dignified identity to these newly uprooted masses. In Istanbul and Ankara, Cairo and Asyut, Algiers and Fez, and on the Gaza Strip, Islamist parties successfully organized and appealed to the downtrodden and dispossessed. The mass of revolutionary Islam, Oliver Roy said, is a product of modern society. The new urban arrivals, the millions of peasants who have tripled the populations of the great Muslim metropolises.